Hello everyone and welcome. In this R70 cluster install nugget, we're going to cover a few points here to help you install your checkpoint cluster from the ground up. The first point we're going to see is that the Splat firewall install. We're going to walk through every step that we need to know to be able to put the CD into a server or a virtual machine and be able to get it up and running from the ground up in order to install secure platform software to get your firewall up and running. Now, once we complete that task, we're going to look at the actual sysconfig process of the firewall, and we'll see exactly which steps we need to walk through in order to get the firewall software enabled, to get our clustering software enabled as well. And then once we have completed that and set up our secure internal communication and everything that we need to know during the actual installation process, we're going to jump into the cluster object config, where we're going to set up the actual secure internal communication. We're going to basically sync that object with our GUI object inside of our smart dashboard application. We're going to set up our actual cluster topology. We're going to basically switch over any objects that we were using in our R65 cluster install. We're going to migrate all that over to our R70 cluster, and then we're going to basically build out a policy. And as part of the policy config, we're going to make sure that any of our rules that we would have used inside of our R65 security policy have been adjusted, and they will directly apply to our R70 cluster as well. And the last thing that we will perform in this particular nugget is we're going to do an actual policy installation, and we're going to do some verification just to make sure that our R70 cluster is set up the way that we want it to be. Again, take wonderful notes, test out the installation, and I know you're going to be successful with the R70 cluster install.
Hello everyone and welcome. In this nugget we are going to set up clustering on our R70 product here. But what we're going to do, instead of actually upgrading our R65 version to R70, we're going to step through a clean install. Now I know this is review for some of us, but for those of us who are new to checkpoint clustering and maybe new to R70, I wanted to run through the actual installation process. That way everyone could be on the same page and see exactly how you build a checkpoint cluster from, having the CD in your hand to deploying your first policy to protect your company. So the first thing we're going to do here is actually build our virtual machine that we will use in order to install the software. So we're going to select new virtual machine, and of course this could be a physical box as well. I already have the ISO on this computer for the R70, so we'll select next. We'll tell it Linux. Select next, and right here we need to give it a name. So we could do R70 underscore cluster underscore A. So that'll be our first node in the mix. It's a good idea to go ahead and copy that because we're going to do the same thing with the B. We'll select next. For hard drive space, I'd like to go ahead and give it 20 gigs. That's sufficient for this install. And now we need to customize our hardware. So at this point, our memory requirements for each cluster node is 512 megs of RAM. CD-ROM, that's perfectly fine for now. Floppy, we don't need it. That can go. USB controller can go. Sound card can go. Display, that's fine. Auto detect, processor. We'll go ahead and give it 2 so we can take advantage of that Core XL information we talked about. And for this first network adapter, the first one is going to be our external adapter, or ETH0, in the secure platform install. So that first adapter, we're going to bridge that to what we are using as our internet segment, which is the 172.20.20.0/24 network. So we'll go ahead and select bridged on that. And alright, that looks good. Now we need to add some additional network adapters. We need a sync adapter that'll pass synchronization packets between the two cluster nodes. That way if one cluster node happens to fail or go offline, everything for the internal traffic and the external traffic coming into the network will be transferred to the secondary node in the cluster. And it's just one of our primary reasons for building our cluster, is to provide that redundancy that we need for the company. So now let's add those additional adapters that we need. So we'll choose add, and we're going to choose network adapter, and we'll select next. And then under this section we choose custom, And what we're going to do is we have these little VMnet networks. Think of these VMnet networks as little switches. You have a physical switch setting on a table, and if you plug two nodes into that switch or two computers, those are in a common VLAN per se. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and choose VNet 2 and click Finish. And VMnet 2 is what we are going to use for our synchronization traffic between our two cluster nodes. Alright, so now that we have our secondary adapter in place, we need to go ahead and choose our third adapter that we will use in this cluster, and that is going to be for our internal interface to the cluster. So our 1021 network will be connected to this interface. So we're going to select the actual option for network adapter again, select next, tell it it's going to be a custom adapter, and in this case VMnet 3 is going to represent the inside interface of our cluster. So we'll select finish at that point, and that pretty much is everything you want to have in your cluster build if you're following along using VMware like I am. So at this point we have our memory, we have our hard drive, we have everything. So we can click OK, go ahead and click finish, and what we should see here is it's going to start up the actual R70 cluster. It'll tell you some things on VMware sometimes down here. Let's go ahead and close that for now. Those don't really apply about VMnet tools, at least in the secure platform world. Alright, so this is going to go ahead and boot up for us now. And just like any secure platform install, by default you get 90 seconds where you need to hit enter and basically walk through the wizard of installing secure platform. Now it's going to say some things here about the actual SOP options and some power options and different things like that as it boots up. And I'm talking about your BIOS and different things, but those errors can be safely annoyed or safely ignored, I should say. Now, okay, so what we should see here is once it comes up to the actual installation wizard, it's going to pop up. We're going to need to step through some default values. Now, the one thing you're going to do in your overall career as a Checkpoint certified security expert is install Secure Platform. You're going to install Secure Platform many times because the majority of all Checkpoint installations today are going to use the Secure Platform operating system. And now that Checkpoint has actually purchased the Nokia division, they're working on integrating the best of IPSO with the best of Secure Platform into a new product that'll look much like Secure Platform. So let's give it a second here, and it'll pop up to our wizard, and we can walk through everything at this point. Okay guys, now we can actually walk through the actual installation process. So what we see is it tells us you have started the installation for Checkpoint Secure Platform R70. This process will install the Checkpoint Secure Platform operating system. And it's also going to tell us that our hardware has been scanned and found suitable for installing Secure Platform. So we're in great shape. So that's the first thing that the product is going to do, is to make sure that your drivers that you have on a physical box or a virtual machine are compatible with the installation of Secure Platform. So it really takes some of the guesswork out and keeps you from wasting time on an install with an uncompatible hardware. So let's select OK at this point, and this will just pop up, and we'll get to walk through some options of formatting the actual hard drive. And again, this is going to take a couple seconds for it to pop up for us. And at this point, we can just pretty much tab through all these options about the software blades and go to OK, because we're going to control all this from the Secure Platform, or I should say our Nugget Cluster Management Server, which is our Nugget Management Server. So we'll select OK there. Now we have an option here for Secure Platform or Secure Platform Pro. Now in review, Secure Platform is going to be your standard operating system installation for your firewall, your management servers, and your smart event or your Eventia servers. In Secure Platform Pro, you typically are only going to use that whenever you need to enable radius-based authentication for your administrators, or you need to run Checkpoint's dynamic routing daemon. If you need to perform some BGP or OSPF routing through a firewall, that's when you'll use Secure Platform. And the good news is, if you ever need it, all you have to do is go into expert mode and type in Pro space enable and then reboot that firewall. But we're going to use standard Secure Platform at that point, or at this current point. So let's go ahead and hit OK. And then we can just hit OK here for me. And it's going to ask us some information here about network adapters. Now what we're going to do in this case is I'm just going to set up the actual inside or outside interface at this point. So ETH0 is going to be our outside interface, and we're going to configure that. Okay, so let's apply that IP now. So we'll go ahead and select ETH0 here. We're going to go to OK. And the IP that we're going to use in this case is going to be a 172.20.20, and we're going to use .3 and .4 for our cluster nodes. And our actual upstream is going to be a .2, so we want to be one off of that. So what we're going to do is we'll use .3 will be our cluster VIP or our external virtual IP. .4 will be our first physical node, and .5 will be our secondary physical node. So that's one concept to remember whenever you're working with a cluster. You have to plan for 3 IPs for every interface. You got to have a virtual IP, and you got to have 2 physical IPs for the actual cluster members. Alright, and so we're going to use .4 here. Our upstream is going to be our .2 for our router. Select OK here. And at this point we get to the option of the built-in HTTPS server, which is on a Checkpoint install. Allows you to get into the web UI to look at some configuration and some different settings for that particular device. And we'll look at that as well. Now the one thing that I like to do is go ahead and change this to a dynamic port, and just something different than the standard 443. I always use 1980, and we'll go ahead and select OK there. And then at this point we should be able to select OK, and at this point we're going to walk through the actual installation, and it's going to go through and format the entire file system and install a secure platform operating system. Now this will just take a couple minutes here. We can see as it goes through and gives us the completed information. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pause for a second here, and when this actually gets complete, we're going to come back in and configure everything through the actual installation, and then we'll look at doing the same for our Nugget Cluster B node that's going to be part of our cluster. Alright guys, our actual installation is done for this Nugget Cluster A, so we can go ahead and select OK here, and this will go through the actual reboot process, and then when it comes up we can walk through the actual installation wizard of configuring all the Checkpoint secure platform options in order to get our Nugget Cluster A actually working for us. Now just keep in mind that whenever you're building a cluster, you're going to have a few things spec'd out. You need to understand how many interfaces are you going to need to cluster. Let's say for example you have a network, and that network has 3 DMZs, and you have an internal network and an external network. So you got to basically plan around that. Most people are going to say that, yeah, well, you need 5 interfaces. A lot of people forget about the sync interface. You got to have the sync interface, so that makes 6, and you may want to have more than that. So most of the time when I'm building an actual cluster, I prefer to use an open system such as a Dell R610 server is what I've been building lately for R70. Or you can get one of Checkpoint's Power 1 appliances, or one of their UTM1 appliances as well are out there for building your actual cluster. But just main thing is plan and make sure you have enough interfaces to allow you growth into the future. So if you are using an open server, you may want to get one and put 4 quad port cards in it. That way you just have the capacity that you need going forward. So alright, at this point where our actual reboot is done, we need to log in and take care of a few things. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and log in, and our default login is admin. Default password is always admin. And once this pops up, oh, sorry about that guys. Admin and admin. Okay, now we need to change our password. So I recommend making this something at least 8 to 10 characters, and just make it as secure as possible. Alright, and I'm just going to use something pretty simple for this demonstration. Then it asks us about our username. Now you can make this username whatever you want it to be, but for this point I'm just going to use admin. So at this point, we pretty much have the password and we have the default administrator password set, and we're logged in at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and log in now, and we're going to run through the configuration. So the first thing we have to issue is an actual sysconfig, and we'll select next and walk through the wizard here. Need to give it a host name. So let's do host name, and that's going to be, we're going to use R70 underscore cluster underscore A, and this is going to be our A node in the actual cluster. So we'll hit enter here. That looks good. We'll use E to exit. Domain name. So let's select that, and we're going to use our actual NU nugget lab.com. Alright, looks good. And then at this point, we can go ahead and hit enter on that, and it tells us that our domain name is set. Enter to continue, and we're always going to use E to exit to get back. Now our domain name servers, let's select those. We're going to add a domain name server, and what we're going to use is something I've been using lately, and that's Google's. This works really well, and it's really fast for updating DNS information. So if you ever manage your own DNS servers like I do, you can actually make a record and MX record changes and all these great things. And as soon as you populate those out your DNS server, you can use this particular DNS server to query those public information, and you'll see them pretty much instantly. So it's a very fast DNS server. So if you're not using it in your network, go ahead and give it a try. Alright, so we have 8.8.8. Let's go ahead and add one more here, just in case we have some type of failure. And we're going to use another public DNS server, which is 4.2.2.2. Looks good. Alright, E to exit. Alright, so network connections. Let's take a look at those now. Now we need to configure a couple. Now we know we already did our external as being the 172.20.20.4. So we need to do our secondary interface, which is ETH1. And this is going to be our sync interface. So we're going to use option number 1. We're going to change the IP on it, and we need to give it just a common IP. What we're going to use is 192.168.100.1 on this A node, and the B node will be .2. And it's going to be a 24-bit mask. So we're going to use 255.255.255.0. Alright, that looks good. And it tells us that that's set on ETH1. Hit enter to continue. We'll use E to exit. And we're going to use option number 2 again to configure a connection. This time we're going to do option number 3 to choose our inside interface, which is ETH2. And let's change the IP on it. And this is actually going to be 10.20.20, or actually 10.20.1.2. So 1021.1 is actually going to be the cluster VIP. The inside interface is .2 on this guy and .3 on the B node in the cluster. So we're going to go ahead and just use a 24-bit mask again. Alright, looks good. Hit enter, enter. Alright, that looks good. And that's pretty much what we want at this point. Go ahead and let's back out here to our main options. And now we can select next. We can select our, or actually let's do one other thing. Let's do a previous. Now there's an option here for routing. Now under routing we can set the default gateway or show the default gateway. And at this point we can just show it. And we can see that we set our 172.20.20.2 as our way of getting to the internet or our outside segment. And that is our default gateway. So I just wanted you to see that as well. And now we can select next. Select our time zone. For me, it's the Americas. And then we're going to use option number 45 for the United States. And then we choose option number 9 here for Central Time. And for me, it's option 1. And then that looks great at that point. Now, one other thing you want to do is always make sure your time is dead on. And your data as well, because that can really affect encryption and certificates and all that great stuff that is very time dependent. You need to make sure your time and all that is dead on. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and set this information as well. So what we can see is that we already set our time zone. So what we're going to do is do option number 4 here, and we want to show our time and date settings. And for me, this is the date is correct, but the time is off. So we need to set our local time. For me, it's going to be 07:40, so 7:40 a.m.
on the 23rd of September 2010. Looks good. Let's go ahead and hit enter at that point. And it'll take that. Now we do option number 4, show date and time settings again. And now we see that our time is dead on. And that's very key in a checkpoint install, that you have your time and date settings on as possible. And it is recommended to use a network time protocol server or an NTP server if you have that available on your network. That's something you should do as well. And NTP is something that we will typically review as part of a CCSA series, and we cover that extensively in the R65 series. But setting up NTP isn't that hard. It's just a couple commands, and if time allows in this particular nugget, we'll look at that as well. But for now, we have our time synced with our local clock and everything, so we're in good shape. Let's go ahead and select next. We'll select next again, because this is a brand new install. If it was a restore or a recovery, we could fetch an actual installation from a TFTP server if we needed to. Alright, so we can go ahead and select next again. Well, we need to hit Y to accept our actual license agreement. We're going to tell it's a new installation, so we'll select next. And we're only going to hit option number 1 here. And option number 1 is the security gateway. And the reason why you see an X right here is user authority, is that product is kind of going away. So they don't want anybody installing that on R70. So we'll select next. And it tells us you have selected the following products, and we're going to use the checkpoint security gateway. So we'll select next here. And it says please wait while it extracts our required files. And this will just take a couple minutes, and once it gets everything set up, at that point we will be able to log into the actual cluster at this point and set up our secure internal communication, or our SIC key. For most of us, it's pretty common. It's like the one-way trusted security certificate between your firewall and your management server. So you have to have a SIC key in place in order to be able to push policy and for your management server to actually trust that firewall out there. So let's give a few minutes. We'll pause for a second here. As we can see, it's running through installing the Checkpoint Security Gateway software. And once this is done, we'll be ready to walk through the actual configuration of logging in, setting up our expert mode password, setting up our SIC key, and then we can do the same thing to the Nugget cluster B node. And once the B node is done, we can dive into the Nugget management server and see how we construct everything from the GUI side of things. Okay, we can see that it's actually completed the base of the cluster installation, and it's going to ask us, is this a dynamically assigned IP address for our gateway? So we're going to say no on this because we are actually setting our IPs. And then at this point, it tells you that you need to install the cluster information. Now, make sure you hit Y here, and this will install the cluster information for this checkpoint HA daemon, as well as state synchronization and the checkpoint load sharing options as well. So we'll select Y here, we'll hit enter. It's going to run through applying the default filter, which is a security policy that will protect the firewall during installation. We'll tell it that we don't want to install licenses right now. We can apply those later via the Smart Update application. And it's going to run through, and we need to set our SIC key here. So our SIC key is what we're going to have to type in on our management server in order to set up that one-way trust between the firewall and our management server. So let's get that put in at this point. Alright. And it's basically going to tell us that the initial module compiled okay, and it's basically done with the actual firewall installation. So at this point, we see our host name, r70_cluster_a. So at this point, we can type in expert, and our expert mode password is going to basically get us into that advanced shell that we need to be able to run all checkpoint commands as well as all Linux commands. So what we're going to do is enter our current password, and now we need to set up the expert mode password. And let's do that now. Alright, so now that we're in expert mode, one thing I like to do is go ahead and change my shell if I am actually controlling all the access to this cluster. I'll go ahead and put myself into an advanced shell, and we can do this for my account only. You can do this in your own access points or your own firewall gateways or management servers for that matter, but you can do it by username. It's my point I want to make. So we're going to do change shell space -s/bin/bash, and my account is admin, and we'll set that up. So at this point it says that we're changing the shell for admin, and the shell's changed. And the reason why we do that is as soon as we log in via the command line to this firewall, instead of having to go through the initial configuration mode or the initial just user mode and then get into a more advanced privilege mode here, it'll take me directly into the privileged point. So we're going to get directly into the bash shell or the bash kernel, which is where I can run everything. So let's go ahead and run it clear at this point. And then at this point, what I like to do is go ahead and reboot the firewall. So I'm going to go ahead and reboot this firewall. And once it comes back up, I'm going to go ahead and configure the Nugget Cluster B node offline, and we'll dive into the GUI and we'll get everything else configured at that point. Alright guys, and now that we have our actual command line options completed for building this cluster, we can build everything that we need inside the GUI. Now we see we already have our Nugget cluster here, and we have our additional nodes and different things, and that's perfectly fine. What we're going to do is walk through the wizard of creating our new cluster that's going to replace the Nugget cluster, and we're going to just walk through everything at this point. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and select new checkpoint security cluster. When we right click here, we'll use simple mode. Go ahead and select OK at this point, and it's going to pop up and ask us what is our cluster name. And for this one we're just going to use R70 underscore cluster. Okay, looks good. And the cluster IP address is going to be the inside virtual IP. So what is the actual default gateway for all of our internal hosts? It's going to be 10.20.1.1. And we're going to use Cluster XL as our first mode we're going to use. And we have the option for Nokia or Nokia IP clustering, or other OPSEC if we were using a Crossbeam box or one of the other providers out there that use a checkpoint daemon on their firewalls. This other OPSEC is what that's for. But for us, Cluster XL is perfectly fine. It's what you're going to do most of the time anyway. So we'll select Next, and it tells us that it's already being used by another object, the actual IP, and that's fine. We're going to select Yes for now. Alright, and now we're going to add our new cluster members in. So our first one is going to be the R70 underscore cluster underscore A is our first node, and its IP address is the 10.20.1.2, and our SIC key that we set up, let's go ahead and enter that as well. Alright, so now we can click initialize, and it tells us there's another object. We'll say yes, and let's continue. And it's going to go out and try to initialize the object for us. Now it said it failed connect to the module. Now one thing we're going to see here is that basically it may be having a typical issue with getting over to the module for whatever reason, and sometimes the default policy can be causing a problem with that, and that's something you're going to see from time to time. So go ahead and select OK there, and we'll hit OK. It'll add it to the mix, and then we'll go back and fix the SIC in a couple minutes here. So let's go to do the same thing with Nugget Cluster B at this point for this node. So we'll do R70 underscore cluster underscore B, and this is going to be the 10.20.1.2, and let's select that activation key as well. Alright, we'll initialize that, say yes to that, and this may have a common problem as well, but we'll hit OK here, but we have both our nodes in the cluster, which is what we want at this point. So our IP address, oh, we gotta fix this. I have this on 1.2. This needs to be the 1.3. Excuse me, guys. 10.21.3. Select yes to that. Okay, that looks better. And now we can just click finish at this point. Now, and basically what it says for certain security gateways we need to specify an OS and all that great stuff. But what we're going to do at this point is we need to try to go ahead and fix our Nugget cluster SIC information and all that great stuff for the new R70 cluster. So we're going to go ahead and just minimize this down at this point, and we're going to see if we can actually putty into them. I may need to go and actually do some additional adjustments, but let's see what we can do here. 1021.2. Let's see if we can get into that guy at this point. And looks like it's trying here. Alright, so it looks like it's probably having some type of communication issue on the actual virtual machine. Let me go in and check that out. I'm sure it's probably just maybe I forgot to power on a node or something as simple as that. So we're going to go ahead and pause here for a second, and then we'll come back. We'll set up SICK and just continue on with this Nugget cluster on R70. Hey guys, I've actually figured out exactly what's going on at this point, and it's basically we had a setting up here in our VMware for this particular Nugget PCA was set a little differently than the actual management server, as well as the inside interface of each cluster node. On my actual network adapter, I had this set to VMnet 2, which I was using before, and we set up the actual inside interface of our cluster to be VMnet 3. So I made this simple change here from 2 to 3 here on this virtual network mapping, and that fixes our problem for us. So it's something to keep in mind in basic troubleshooting. If you're using VMware, make sure every node that needs to talk on a common subnet, like the 1021 subnet, has the same VMnet in place. So that's just a quick way of having an error there. So we'll select next at this point. We'll select yes like we did before, and now we can actually set up the actual firewalls and set up the SICK key information. So we'll say new cluster member, and this is going to be the R70 underscore cluster underscore A, and we'll go ahead and copy that as well. And this IP is going to be the 10.20.1.2, and let's set up our SICK keys. And let's try this one more time here. Alright, and that time we see trust established. We're in great shape, and the actual SICK communication is communicating. So having it on the right switch or VMnet switch is pretty important. We can see that that caused my root problem there. So let's go ahead and add our secondary node to the mix. We'll paste that in, change this to a B, and this becomes 10.20.1.3. Put its SICK key in. Initialize that. Trust established. Alright, and it's communicating. So we're in great shape here, guys. We have both of our cluster members added to our R70 cluster, and we established trust with them. Now we can just go ahead and click finish at this point. It's going to give us a option here where we can dive in and do a few more things. But at this point, what we want to do is we can actually dive in and start building our overall policy here. Now, we see that we have one policy right here that we were using for our original Nugget cluster on R65. I'm going to go ahead and start fresh. I want everybody to see exactly how we're going to step through everything, and we have our default policy here for the R70 cluster. So we'll start fresh with everything. So a couple things we're going to need to do, like any networks that we have defined, and under like NAT properties where it says install on gateway, we need to change that to like R70 underscore cluster, and we'll hit OK there. So that'll be for the inside network. And then we may have some nodes that we set up NATs on. In this case, like we have our PC NAT for 172. Or this 1021.25 is NATed over to this IP. So if we open this guy up and go to NAT, we can see that's on Nugget cluster. We change that to the R70 cluster. So those are the two NATs that we have in place we're going to need to fix. And at this point, we should be able to just make a duplicate policy from our existing policy, change up our install information, and that should pretty much do it and take care of the actual policy installation. And then we'll dive into our actual R70 cluster and go in and configure all of our interface information. So let's do that now. So what we want to do is do File, and we're going to do a copy policy to package, do save and continue. So we're going to save this policy to a brand new package, and that way we can deploy it on our R70 cluster. The only thing we want here is our security and address translation rules. We'll select next, and we're going to give it a name. In this case, it's just going to be the R70 underscore cluster policy. We'll select next. And it says, well, it's already in use because we're using the name. So we'll do underscore policy. I think it'll like that much better. Alright, so we'll select finish. So what it's going to do is go ahead and copy our current policy that we're using on the Nugget cluster and then move that over to our R70 cluster as an option. So now we should be able to do File, Open. We see it as an option. We should be able to open it now. And once it opens up here, we should be good to go. So at this point, what we're going to want to do is go through and just check everything out and make sure it's set up the way that we want it to be. So under policy, installation targets, we don't have anything here, and it says this is for our R70 cluster policy. It's a good idea to always lock this in so you don't ever run the risk of installing the wrong policy on the wrong firewall. So we choose specific modules, we'll choose R70 cluster, we'll add it to the mix. So that looks good at this point. Now we need to expand each one of our security rules here, and we need to make sure everything is set up the way it should be. Anywhere we see our Nugget cluster, we're going to go ahead and replace that with our R70 cluster. So what we're going to do is, this cool thing that they have in R70 now is this little box right here. You can select this little box and it'll drop down and you can easily find objects. It's pretty awesome. It's something I've been wanting for a very long time from Checkpoint. So we'll choose the R70 cluster, and then at this point all we have to do is basically copy this object, and then anywhere we see the cluster we can paste it in and then remove the Nugget cluster. We can always just right click, paste it in, remove the Nugget cluster. So you can see that it's pretty easy to clean up an object like this, or to migrate a policy to a new firewall. So we have our Nugget PCA, it's going to be natting, Nugget management. We have our Nugget management for our management traffic, our R70 cluster, kind of a bi-directional rule here between some of these guys. So if this node right here, which has a NAT on it, needs to talk to the R70 cluster or the Nugget management server over these particular protocols, we're going to accept that. Now the thing that we're doing here, and what you'll see, is that the install on is on Nugget cluster. So we'll need to go to this point right here and do add, select targets, select the R70 cluster, click OK here, click on the Nugget cluster, delete that out. Same thing here. Go to targets, R70 cluster, OK, Nugget cluster, remove that. So, and what we'll do is dive through all that, and I'm just going to walk through all these basic rules, and anywhere I see the Nugget cluster, I'm going to remove the that option, put the R70 cluster in place. Now for our NATs that we were talking about earlier, for our Nugget PCA, let's open that guy up and go to NAT, and we're going to make sure that it's installing on the R70 cluster. That looks fine. And for our actual internal network, we're going to NAT all that traffic behind the R70 cluster, and that's set up as well. So we're good to go on the 1020.1 network. So just give me a couple minutes. I'm going to run through, take out Nugget cluster from all these areas in the policy, and then at that point we should be able to deploy our policy out to our R70 cluster and get everybody behind the 1021 network secured and browsing the web. So let's just give it a moment. We'll come back and check that out. Okay guys, I think I've cleaned up our policy to the point where we can actually go through and define some things for our R70 cluster. So everywhere that I saw an actual R70 or our actual Nugget cluster listed, I replaced it with the R70 cluster. And that included everything on the install on column and everything for the actual NAT information as well. So we have our very basic setup at this point. We can still see that we see our Nugget portal right here, which was allowing our 172, and that's fine as well. We have our actual management traffic rule. We have our stealth rule that basically says anybody directly toward the R70 cluster, we're going to drop them, but we have these rules above the stealth rule that allows us to administer our particular cluster. Like in this case, we have our trainer machine, which is behind the scenes here, is on the 172.20.20.6 network, is allowed to hit Nugget PCA over FTP, ping, and remote desktop, because this guy right here, if we open this up, has a NAT on it to 172.2020.25, and that's on the R70 cluster. So we're in great shape there. Now, the one thing we need to do at this point is to go ahead and dive in and see if we can configure our actual cluster properties at this point. So that's what we need to do next. Alright guys, I hope you're ready. Now we can configure our cluster and actually get all of our topology defined. So finally we're at the point where we can deploy our policy out to our R70 cluster and get everything set up the way we want it. Now we have a couple rules here. We've already talked about the majority of them. For internal to internet, it's pretty simple. The source on the packet is our internal network going outbound, and we're doing any for now. If we wanted to really control this and keep our guys from going anywhere, we could on our DMZs, if we had other DMZs defined, that's where we always have the concept of using negate here. So if we wanted to add an object and we specified our 172 network, for example, like this, we could hit OK and we could actually negate the cell, which means that our internal hosts or our users on our internal network can go anywhere except this network. And that's the whole properties of negate at this point. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just leave this option in, because we want to allow our internal users to be able to go outbound, but we don't want them going to external IPs whenever they're testing things. So basically, if anybody from the inside network, they needed to go through the firewall, they don't need to hit any of our static NATs or anything on the public segment. And that's just one way we're going to control security here, making sure that everybody from the inside always goes through the firewall. And if anything that you want to see on the 172 segment, you need to come from the internet segment, the 172, toward this particular side right here. And that's where we have it set up here for these rules that are above the stealth rule, to allow like Nugget PC A to be RDP'd or pinged or FTP'd from the actual trainer machine, which is on the 172 network, and it's hitting the actual NAT here. And that's pretty much what we want at this point. So we should be good to go, and all we have to do at this point is go ahead and pretty much get everything in place, get our policy defined, and then we'll be ready to set up the actual Nugget cluster. And we should be good to go at that point, and that's pretty much what we want to do for the R70 cluster at this point. So what we want to do is go ahead and dive into the topology. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do edit topology. We're going to tell it to get all members interfaces. And what we're going to see is it pulled everything down. And the fact that we had a duplicate topology and everything from our old cluster to our new cluster, we can see it just pulled everything over very nicely for us. And we can see that ETH0 on each of the firewalls match up with the same network and the same subnet mask. Same for ETH1 and ETH2. So that's one key thing to do whenever you first grab the topology and you pull it into your cluster object. Make sure this is 100% correct, otherwise you will have some problems getting things to work. So now we need to define our actual virtual IPs or our virtual interfaces for our cluster. So for our R70 cluster, what we're going to do here, we're going to edit the interface. We're going to tell it ETH0. I like to use the name of the interface as my cluster object, but we can get kind of creative here. Let's call this outside. This is our outside network. So we see this, we know it's outside. The IP address for this guy is 172.20.20.3 at this point is our VIP, because 4 and 5 are our physical nodes. And then it's 255.255.255.0. That looks good. And we go ahead and select OK at this point. It's going to give us this little message. Tell it, don't show you this message again. Hit OK, and there we go. We have it defined as a cluster interface, and this is our actual outside interface. Now we need to do our next one. This is our sync interface, so it's our first sync, and that's all we need to do. We need to say that ETH1 on each of these firewalls are connected via a crossover cable, or they're in a common VLAN that allows the synchronization traffic to pass from Nugget firewall cluster A member to the B member that's part of this cluster. So we set that as first sync. Okay, and then our next one, and that's going to be another cluster interface. So we're going to edit this interface. We're going to tell this is actually our inside interface, and the IP address on it is the 10.20.1.1 and a 24-bit subnet mask 255.255.255.0. Looks good. Alright, so that pretty much takes care of all of our requirements that we want for setting up our topology here on our cluster. Now we need to go in and do edit interface, go into topology, make sure this is set to external, make sure your anti-spoofing option is set to perform anti-spoofing on interface topology, and you can also set up where you don't want to perform anti-spoofing on a certain network. That is available in R70. So we'll hit OK at that point. Do the same thing for this particular interface. Make sure the topology is right. It's internal, network's defined by its interface IP and net mask, and performing anti-spoofing. Looks great at that point. Now we can select OK here. And at this point we want to go back to general, make sure that everything is shown to be correct here. We have an open server, we're using R70, it's on secure platform. We're not doing a VPN right now, but we'll go ahead and leave that on for IPsec and VPN. That's perfectly fine. We have our IPS information, Cluster XL is turned on as well, and that's pretty much everything we want at this point. Couple other things for housekeeping here under capacity and optimization. Right now we have our maximum connections that can go through the firewall at 25,000. I like to up this value to about 50,000 just to make sure that I never hit a threshold there. Everything else here is pretty much okay. You want to leave this on automatic for our VPN capacity optimization. Leave this at 200, and this maximum concurrent tunnels can be at 10,000. So that's perfectly fine at this point. And that's pretty much everything we want to do on the GUI side as far as our Nugget cluster or our R70 cluster as part of this Nugget lab is concerned. So we can select OK at this point, and that should pretty much save all of our properties for this particular cluster object. So all we have to do at this point is pretty much go in and save our policy, and then once we save our policy we can deploy this policy out to the Nugget cluster. So one thing you want to do before you attempt to deploy your policy is go back into the cluster object,